Hi, this is Phil Fry, Director of Business and Finance for the Sun Prairie Area School District, giving the school board and the public an up to date where we're at with budget discussion. So we over the last 3 months have spent a lot of time with the school board and just want to recap some of that work and then talk about the future. So first is we talked about the current budget forecast for the Sun Prairie Area School District. We're going to talk about the Wisconsin funding and how that has not kept up with inflation. And then we're going to talk about budget stewardship in Sun Prairie School District. And just to recap, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because you've heard this information before. All the links are in here to previous board meetings. So why we do budget forecasting and how is here, so you can read those for yourself if you want. What kind of key assumptions we use for enrollment. So right now we're building the budget off of 60 student growth for next year. And we are continuing to look at that like the school board asked us to do. Other key assumptions, we're using the $325 that the state has approved for all Wisconsin school districts. So with that, the really what is the outcome of that budget forecasting? Showing that for the 24-25 school year, next fiscal year will be about over $3 million short. And then that deficit grows over the next 4 years after that to almost $10 million if nothing had been changed by 28-29. Just a reminder that we did factor in the referendum that we had in 2022. But remember that we built that referendum on assumption that we get adequate state funding from the state, which that has not happened. And then we talked about with the board back in January that the process for the 24-25 budget would be to fill that gap, so to speak, with budget stabilization funds. And then that we'll look at different measures for future budgets. And just saying that it's not sustainable to tap into fund balance year after year. And again, that we'll look at future things, specifically a referendum to cover deficits, which we'll talk a lot more about in the next few slides. So then in March, we spent a lot of time with the school board, and you can see it linked here about how the state of Wisconsin's funding impacts school districts. Basically, that the state has not kept up with K-12 public school funding compared to where it was even 20 years ago. That we've fallen in the state from 11th in the nation in spending to 25th. That the increases have definitely not kept up with inflation. In fact, you'll see on the next slide, we're way behind where inflation versus what we actually received. Almost 3,000, or actually over $3,300 behind. And for Sun Prairie School District, that difference between our increase in inflation represents about a $27 million increase to our budget on an annual basis if we just kept up with inflation. So again, and then the $325 that was put into the last budget, again, does not keep up with inflation. It's about a 2.5% increase for 23-24, and about a 2.4% increase for 24-25. So again, I'm going through this pretty quick because the school board has spent a lot of time on this the last few months, but we just wanted to recap. Then at our last school board meeting on April 29th, again, which is linked in here, we talked about the budget stewardship that's happened in our district. Really trying to tell a better story. We often go to the school board when we have bids to approve, but we really don't talk about when we're saving or shifting dollars in the budget. We have a purchasing policy that requires bidding. We did in 2017-2018 fiscal year have pretty substantial budget reductions. So reminded people of that we had to reduce our budget by $2.3 million then. And quite a bit of that came through staffing. And then we went through line items from each department that add up to over $5 million of what we've done for budget stewardship over the last year or so. Things like tiering bus routes, wellness clinics. And again, the list was pretty extensive, and we tied that list again, to that April 29th school board meeting. So just, again, I went through that really quick, but just some budget presentation takeaways that the budget forecast model shows that we're running structural deficits, and that deficit will reach $10 million by 28, 29. Second bullet, that the state of Wisconsin funding has not kept pace with inflation, leaving all school districts without the funds to maintain programs. And third bullet is the district administration takes budget stewardship very seriously. In an environment of scarce resources, we put much effort into stretching dollars as far as possible. And again, that on an annual basis, that has been over $5 million each year. So moving forward, we really have to have the board think what steps will we need to take to ensure that the school board's objectives within the SRs, the ORs, and OE policies are met given the current status of the district's budget. And also the low likelihood that increased revenue from the state will match inflation in an environment where we're already trying to stretch our dollars as far as we can. So need the board to really think about that. What things will we do? Specifically for the 24-25 fiscal year, which starts less than 2 months away now, July 1st. We recommend that we continue to use, or we will use budget stabilization fund balance to avoid destabilizing the system. If the school board said we have to make some reductions, we could do that, but there's a few things we have to remember. All contracted positions are already set, but non-contracted positions, support staff, admin support could be reduced. We would have to look, there's different ways that we could make budget reductions. Again, we're recommending that we don't do this and use budget stabilization. But if the board says we need to make reductions, we could do across the board cuts on areas that are non-fixed costs. For instance, we could cut utilities and busing, but we could cut building budgets, department budgets if needed. We have to review all our spending to see where we're an outlier compared to other districts, and continue to look at the budget for efficiencies to see if we can reduce costs there. So if the board at this point wants to make reductions to the 24-25 budget, that's what we'd recommend. Moving forward to the fiscal year 25-26, remember that we can't continuously tap into budget stabilization fund balance. That's not a sound fiscal practice. What we recommend is we have a formation of a task force with broad representation on it. Again, if we're going to look at budget reductions, that's what we'd recommend. We'd hold steering committee meetings from November to about April of 2025. We'd identify opportunities for community and staff input. And again, look at different ways, methodologies that we could reduce the budget. And you can see those listed here. Again, moving, kind of switching gears a little bit, but we have definitely talked about our operating referendum. We would recommend that the referendum be tied to the November presidential election, so November of 2024. By June 15th, we'll need clear direction from the board on whether or not we're going to move ahead with that referendum. It seems like the board has supported that in the last few months of discussions, but we want to have clear direction from the board. In July and August, we would need to identify the amount that we're going to ask for in the referendum and the structure. For instance, is it going to be a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, whatever referendum? We need to come up with a communications and engagement plan. And by the end of August, have the final resolution approved by the school board. In September, October timeline, we'd obviously implement our communication plan in the referendum. And November 5th is the presidential election, so that's when the referendum would be held. So that's for the May, I think it's May 15th, get my dates right here. But on May 28th, there's another school board meeting, or on May 14th, I should say, is when this is presented to the board. May 28th, we're presenting and having a more in-depth conversation with the school board regarding the next steps. At that meeting, district leadership will expand on the potential plans for budget reductions and or operating referendum for consideration by the school board. So I went through that pretty quick. Again, a lot of this was recap. We just wanted to recap what we've done over the last 3 months in our budget discussions with the board. And then just looking ahead to timing of referendums, timing of reductions, if that's the way the school board wants to go. So we'll have more discussion on this on Monday night and then again on May 28th. Thank you.